Hello, thank you. All right. All right, so looking at what we have here, we're doing the civil rights movement. All right, so here are the questions that you have posted that you will be confronting on test 3. And let's see how many there are. Number 6, I believe, is the only one that you will not find on this handout. Number 6. So remind me to come back to that, okay? To make sure that you're prepared for that one. All right, and so with the civil rights movement, what do we have here as far as a series of arguments? So the civil rights movement, primarily the 1950s and the 1960s, was a very it didn't have one coherent head to it. It was variegated. It had many different facets, many different parties with their own philosophies, their own MO that they followed. But oftentimes, the goal seems to have been one of the two following: either integration or actually promoting segregation. But one way or another, those two sides shared on the integrationist spectrum. They shared the recognition of human rights, basic human rights that are attached to, the Atlantic Charter that President Franklin Roosevelt had issued with Churchill during World War II, talking about basic human rights that all human beings ought to be entitled to under any government. And so where to begin? You have the most salient as far as press coverage, I would make the argument, would be the African-American movement. And with the African-American movement, you have those who had begun by the early 1900s under the NAACP, and their primary tactic was to try to fight and win in the courts, try to take people to court and try to have, Plessy versus Ferguson overturned and other types of discriminatory pro-segregation decisions, and try to get a reversal in the courts on those. And you have some famous cases. If you wanted me to, I don't have the list with me just right now, but I could give you a list of some important, and the textbook does as well, some important cases that were won by the NAACP and by their Hispanic counterparts of LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, primarily in Texas. And so they fought and they won some big cases in the courts, no doubt. And number one does not try to at least overtly diminish that, their success, much less the crusade that they lived, as far as, all the daily deprivations and the passion and the sacrifices that they entailed to win these cases in the courts. Then you have your direct action organizations, right? And by direct action, primarily, they were willing to confront institutions that were, in their eyes, in violation of basic human rights for certain demographics. So arguably the most, again, salient by its numbers and by the press that it received might be considered SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, with Bob Moses, Diane Nash, James Bevel, had begun, I believe, at the University of Tennessee. And you're going to get academia really involved in the civil rights movement. And with SNCC, right, they're going to, in particular, they're going to study the writings and the life of Mohandas Gandhi, right, in India. And you know what he did in his nonviolent civil disobedient crusade in India against the British. So at any rate, they're going to take from his book, if you will, and they're going to actually train people. They're going to train people to prepare to go to whites only restaurants and other public places that are segregated, and to step into the whites only sections and ask for service, knowing full well that they not only would not receive the service, but that they would be verbally and in some cases physically attacked. There would be a white backlash, if you will, against what they knew they would be doing. Other times to try to, well, we'll get into that as to why, but they would sing oftentimes hymnals, religious songs, and other songs of inspiration, read from scripture, chant, and do other things while they were in these whites only sections of private businesses and public accommodations that were segregated at that time. So with nonviolent civil disobedience, right? I think of, Gandhi, I think of Christ, the notion that man-made or civic laws ought to be in subservience to natural higher divine laws, that there are moral absolutes. And amongst the moral absolutes is the golden rule of Jesus, right? Treat others as you would want them to treat you. And civic laws sometimes get that wrong. And they're in violation of that higher law of human egalitarianism, of everyone should be on equal footing with the same rights, privileges, opportunities, protections under law. So when you find a case in which a civic law goes against a higher law, remember also the transcendentalists earlier in US history adhered to this, Henry David Thoreau, some of even the beatniks of the 1950s as well. But you go and you defy this immoral civic law that goes against nature or God's higher laws, and you do it in good conscience, and you do it knowing that you're likely going to be martyred, that you're there, because the notion is, right, is that you're confronting your oppressor and you wish to shame him by a soul force, as Gandhi called it. The idea is, right, is that there's a basic belief in the inherent goodness of people, and that much of the immorality, the maliciousness that could be found in people has been environmentally learned. They've been socialized into it. When they bombed Martin Luther King's home, he told an angry mob of people, don't retaliate. The people who did this don't know any better. They've been taught from infancy to hate Black people. And what the hope was, right, is that's not truly the essence of who these white people were. There was hope that they were redeemable, right? That what could be learned can be, quote, unlearned, right? If it's by nurture rather than by nature. But the problem is rationalization. People most often don't go to bed, including the segregationists, thinking I'm the bad guy. I'm a horrible person. Look at all the bad things I'm doing. I need to change, etc. That there needs to be an extraneous force that comes upon them that forces them to deal with their own immoral practices and beliefs. And so you confront them, but oftentimes human nature is very stubborn, and human nature is very defensive, so that they're not going to like it at the moment. And if anything, it's going to push to the surface the ugliness of what they've been taught. And they're likely going to react in a very ugly manner, right? So I think of like the 4 freshman boys at Greensboro, Carolina, who in 1960 came into a whites only counter They poured milkshakes over their heads. They spit on them. They called them all kinds of awful names, and they just took it. And they just stayed there in their seats day after day. It was multiple days that this happened. But that finally, right, a white woman stands up and says, and pats one of them on the back and says, basically, good for you boys. You should have done this a long time ago. And so the idea is that the people who react in an ugly fashion, they're going to have to go to bed, and they're going to have to confront the fact that, wait a minute, I acted in such a way that was violent, that was abusive, that was oppressive, but these protesters didn't do anything in return, right? That you almost subconsciously wanted them to, so that you could rationalize being mean to them. But instead, they're sticking to the high ground, and they're forcing you to go to bed and think on what you're doing, on the policy that you're supporting, and that in the long run, you're trying to win them over, largely via shame, to get them to become ashamed of themselves for how they're treating you. And then the idea is there was a Rip Van Winkle speech by Martin Luther King to the white segment of America. And he said he's afraid that most Americans were tending their own gardens in a state of slumber. And that's a Roman term. Tending your own garden is, as long as it doesn't affect you immediately and your family and your inner circle of loved ones, then you don't care. Then you're kind of apathetic. You keep yourself busy with your daily life, with your chores, with your work, with your social relationships. And what's going on down in Alabama and Mississippi is none of your business. So that's where the press comes in, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and other organizations like them, like the SCLC and MIO, is they wanted to bring in cameras. They wanted to, because what they're trying to do is to elicit the shame, elicit the compassion, even elicit a sense of indignation. And remember, indignation is righteous anger, something that you ought to become angry with. They're trying to elicit that from the majority of white Americans to gain their sympathy. And so at any rate, it's one route to take. And on number one, you're going to see that the writer praises that route and says that not only that was it a morally respectable route to take, but that it was necessary. It was necessary in winning white America over. Now, to the extent it did, it's hard to, factually support wholeheartedly with data, because you have, NBC, ABC, Time Magazine, Gallup polls, etc. And sometimes in the short run, it didn't have that effect, according to those sources. Sometimes in the short run, there was a sense that these protesters were troublemakers, that, yeah, they were being peaceful. Yes, they were getting themselves beaten up and arrested, etc., and not their oppressors. But yet they're causing a confrontation that's not necessary, right? That they're basically provoking the segregationalists to get ugly with them. But when you find evidence also of the 1964 Civil Rights Act against segregation, passed by Lyndon B. Johnson's Congress, you also find a lot of evidence of them using data from those mentioned polls, press organizations, and so forth, saying that the American public feels like something needs to be changed, that this chaos can't ensue, that some concessions need to be given to the protesters. And that's where I go with number one, right, is in the writing of number one. I'm contending that this was effective, that it helped bring about, if not the public shame and indignation that they aimed for, it at least gave a sense of urgency to their generation, and saying, if the continuation of the same thing and expecting the same results constitutes insanity, then it'd be insane to just keep things as they are. That it kind of pushed Americans into supporting the Civil Rights Acts under Lyndon B. Johnson's administration. So it's contending, right, that those who fought in the courts, they did a very good job, and one that did make a difference, but not enough. That these nonviolent, civil, disobedient protesters were necessary to sufficiently rock the boat, to force the country to have discourse on this topic and to confront it and to do something about it. Okay. And so you see there, to win white America's heart via shame. And you have NBC aired a 3-hour special on American Revolution of '63, in which they contended that the March on Washington, as well as the reaction of white violence upon peaceful protesters in Birmingham, was creating a revolution. All right. And let's see here. Racial issues, claim the U.S. News and World Report, have moved out to the front in people's thoughts, thanks to these movements, arguably, right? The government counted 758 racial demonstrations following Birmingham in 186 cities. So it caught fire, this movement. You also had CORE, Congress on Racial Equality, and they were most famous for the Freedom Rides, in which they drove illegally, technically, right, integrated passengers throughout the South, black sitting by white, which was, of course, against the law in most of the southern states. The black passengers were to sit in the back, the white passengers in the front. And so, again, in the short run, it didn't seem to have much success, this Freedom Ride, as not a single bus made it to its final destination. You have one famous case in which a bus was stopped and they began throwing Molotov cocktails into the bus, and they had to run out of the bus for their lives. You have a case of some being arrested, and the local racist sheriff released them in the middle of the night so that the Klan could attack them once they were released from jail. And so in the short run, it was ugly. And I don't know my rights on YouTube, if I have a right to do this, but at least I could feign ignorance. Not even feign, I could claim ignorance, because I'm not overtly aware that it is illegal. But I was hoping I could show this YouTube video, but maybe not. At any rate, all you have to put up is Birmingham footage, and it's nasty. The water hoses, the clubs, the canines, just people singing, marching peacefully, and being brutally attacked. And this was put on in the newspapers. This was videoed and put on the televisions, and it supposedly, like I said, got the ball rolling in forcing America to have discourse on this topic about changing something. All right. So pretty much praises that type of the necessity of that type of protest. Are there any questions on number one? All right. With number two, this is just simply great man history. When it comes to causation of the Civil War, it's like on the other side of the spectrum of structural history, which we'll get to toward the end. Very simple thesis, saying that if you didn't have key individuals making some very vital decisions at key points, the civil rights movement may not have gone as successfully as it did. If you had taken these people, these individuals, out of the equation. So Irene Morgan and Rosa Parks, right, refusing to give their seats over. and it started the Montgomery bus boycott organization. The boycott was very successful and helped lead to the Morgan decision, helped bring about the legal end of segregated busing. Okay, so what if it had not been for these two women? Dr. Martin Luther King, this guy was all over the place geographically and so forth, right? With Dr. Martin Luther King, he was well connected, period, to the highest of academia by way of the Ivy League schools. And there was a lot of support from schools like Stanford and Yale. He was highly connected to the government and oftentimes met with Robert Kennedy and other high-ranking members of the federal, bureaucracy, if you will. And he earned, if nothing else, some respect from a lot of them, and concern about his obstinate insistence on keeping the movement going, particularly with nonviolent civil disobedient acts. So, of course, most famously, he went into Birmingham and he was arrested there. He went into Florida, St. Augustine and Lincolnsville, and was arrested there. He would go to the West Coast and give speeches. And it was not always about his movement. Sometimes it was trying to defend his movement. His famous March on Washington, right, where he gave his "I Have a Dream" speech. He just, when he spoke, people listened. Large audiences, high-ranking congressmen, and members of the executive branch. And without him, things may not have been the same. Then you also have trailblazers, like I mentioned, CORE. Look up people like Bayard Rustin, Jim Peck, Jim Farmer. They were just incredible at organizing people, at organizing African Americans in particular, in trying to do a myriad of things: register to vote, boycott busing, you name it. Then you also have the Chicano movement. And if you look up the Chicano movement by PBS video, you'll find a person who's often mentioned in this movement, especially at Crystal City, was Jose Angel Gutierrez, the young Mexican-American college student, grad student, who was interested in the writings of Gandhi, etc. And he single-handedly did a lot as far as going door to door and registering Hispanic Americans to register to vote, getting them to vote for a candidate that was sympathetic to their plight on election days. And matter of fact, the entire school board of Crystal City, Texas, by way of mobilizing the Hispanic bloc vote, were able to vote in nothing but Mexican Americans onto that council. They also had a December 9th walkout in 1969 because a lot of the curriculum did not cater did not even relate to the plight of Mexican Americans, their culture, their legacy, their history, to give them any sense of inclusion and pride in who they were. There weren't many Hispanic teachers, so they were angry about the curriculum, the teachers, and so forth. And they felt like if they could change those things, the high dropout rates, high school dropout rates amongst young Chicano or Hispanic boys could greatly be diminished, and try to keep them in the school. And so you have cases like that. You have Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, with the help of a priest named Fred Ross, register Hispanics to vote, get them to unionize into the United Farm Workers Union. And they employed the strike, huelga. They employed the boycott on goods that were being produced without the basic necessities being afforded to the migrant workers who were engaging in those cultivation of those products, like grapes. The grape boycott was huge, and I would say largely successful. And so they wanted basic minimum wages, workers' compensation for injuries. They wanted access to shade and water breaks, just basic things, right? That human rights that they felt the migrant workers were entitled to. They organized very effectively in making those demands. So what if you didn't have Cesar Chavez? What if you didn't have Jose Angel Gutierrez? All right. And then, the Supreme Court cases were big, but then there was, Governor George Wallace of Alabama, Orville Faubus of Arkansas, these white racist governors. They just said, fine, the decision was made, but we're going to ignore it. And there was great, defiance of the Supreme Court decisions. So then it took brave individuals to try to enforce those decisions. So you have the Little Rock Nine, you see here at the bottom. Look at the looks that this young lady's getting. As Brown versus the Board of Education had famously been won, overturning segregation in public schools and high schools in Topeka, Kansas, and not just there, but throughout the country. And so at a Central Valley High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, 9 Black students had the courage to come and to enforce that decision, and saying that they were a part of the constituency of that school now. And again, a lot of vicious backlash they incurred for quite some time, but it arguably succeeded. And that in the case of both these cases, with Little Rock, Arkansas, with James Meredith going into the University of Mississippi, the president himself and the attorney general had to step in and force the governor to step down on the issue. And they actually used troops to protect, to chauffeur these Black students throughout the campus so they would not be attacked by white students. So what if you didn't have these key individuals, I'm saying, right? Not a very deep thesis, but something to consider, okay? A great man history of the civil rights movement. All right, any question on number 2? Number 3, controversial, okay? And I intended it to be, is stating that the militant organizations had their place that was necessary in the civil rights movement. You look at Elijah Muhammad in the Nation of Islam, okay? They did not want to integrate with white America. They religiously, with their Muslim beliefs, formulated a thesis that white people literally emanated historically, scripturally, from the devil. So that whole moniker, white devil, they wanted to stay segregated from the white race. With Malcolm X and others as a Harlem mosque leader and member of the Nation of Islam, he wanted to go to the UN above America's head and make demands upon the UN to do something about the segregation laws, but to also help subsidize Black migration back to Africa because they had no hope in integration. Also, with the Nation of Islam, is they carried guns. They had soldiers who trained militarily for self-defense. And they contended that they were going to defend themselves and especially their families should they be attacked by racist white segregationists. And, it's interesting as far as the dilemma of that is you could look up Freedom Summer down in Mississippi. At Freedom Summer, the campaign, right? A lot of the members like Stokely Carmichael and others, they had no qualms with adhering to nonviolent civil disobedience when they engaged in formal sit-ins and parades, etc., right, and demonstrations. They wouldn't hit back. They would not retaliate. But nevertheless, they had a camp where they kept their families, their wives, their children, right? And in that camp, those very same adherents to nonviolent civil disobedience began to carry guns and continued that they wouldn't take them out of their house. They had no offensive plans to use them against the white Americans, but that should the white Americans attack their homes in the middle of the night, and we're predominantly talking about the KKK, which was alive and well and nasty at this time, that they were going to use those guns to protect their kids and their families. And so one of the best sources for this, and you could, decide if how telling that is as far as, supportive data, but is in the person of Lyndon B. Johnson himself. Matter of fact, I should have, I don't know why I have not yet put a direct quote or two that I've read from some books whereby Lyndon B. Johnson almost tries to scare Congress into passing civil rights legislation and saying, we either help the African Americans out or they're going to kill us out on the streets. And of course, at one time, passed the famous 64 Act. There'd be a Voting Rights Act in 65 and other acts as well that came subsequent to the big 64 Act. He oftentimes alluded to the Watts riots, and the Watts riots in California, in Southern California, emanated from a young Black kid being pulled over by a cop. Words were exchanged. The young man's mother came to the car and was assailed by the cop. The young man came out to protect his mother, and they got in a physical tussle. And so this stuff was happening. You look at the Stokes trial, Muslim mosque, and I believe Southern California as well. It was after hours. They were selling suits from the back of their trunk car, and a cop came in to see if they were selling guns, knowing that they were members of the Nation of Islam and carried guns and so forth. And an altercation ensued, and a couple people were killed and badly wounded. And so Lyndon B. Johnson, on more than one occasion, tells Congress, guys, instead of saying, we should be ashamed of ourselves, as he sometimes did, instead of saying you should feel won over by the sacrificial, peaceful protest of the nonviolent protesters, he says, guys, we're going to have a civil war on our hands if we don't give African Americans something. So my point being on number 3 is that, the more militant organizations like the Nation of Islam, like the Black Panthers, had their place in wanting to, in kind of goading and pushing America to do something about civil rights. Because remember, we have as human beings a myriad of motives, emotional motives and psychological ones that could help lead us to do what we do. And of course, one, as you saw in number 1, could be compassion, right? Empathy, righteous indignation. But that doesn't work with everyone, arguably, right? Not everyone could be shamed, says the argument on number 3. Some people have to become afraid. They have to become deterred before they're willing to do something about an injustice. And so hence this wing of the civil rights movement had its part. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale and the Black Panthers, they actually followed cops around in the Oakland area that would pull over fellow Black Oakland young men, and they would rise to the defense of those young men being pulled over. And you had cases where you had shootouts between the Black Panthers and the cops. So sometimes, things got violent, and sometimes, like on number one, there was a backlash against these organizations. The FBI really stepped it up in trying to put a lid on these militant groups that it was frightened by. But at the same time, who's to say that they did not also have I hate to say coercive, but some type of almost semi-coercive effect on the civil rights movement, and giving a sense of urgency to the white people, the white demographic of their generation, that something needs to be done. All right. So are there any questions on number 3? That's the 10-point program of the Black Panthers, and Huey Newton on the right and Bobby Seale on the left. That's Malcolm X to the left. And as you may know, Malcolm X is going to become less militant after his Hajj, or his pilgrimage to Mecca, whereby he meets white and other ethnic group Muslims and becomes more embracing of a universal Islam, and states that Islam could be the answer to ending racism in America. Similar to Martin Luther King, right? Martin Luther King said the same thing about Christianity, that Christianity taught people to become colorblind and could help Americans overcome racism. And then number 4 is structural history. Number 4 contends, right, that there were large and personal forces that brought the civil rights movement about, as opposed to key individuals that you saw in number 2. All right. So this is the structural argument. World War II arguably raised expectations. We were fighting fascism. We had the Atlantic Charter. We contended that we were fighting for the human dignity of all human beings. And so therefore the hypocrisy of segregation and racial discrimination became very, very unpalatable, right? It was too difficult to swallow. It was so brazenly evident that we were being hypocritical. Not to mention the fact that the soldiers had fought so valiantly in World War II, and so that it enhanced their expectations of what they felt they were entitled to, having fought for this country. You have some cases of injustice that occurred that helped bring about this kind of righteous indignation and higher expectation coming from World War II. And like the case of oh gosh, I could picture his face, Hispanic soldier who was killed in World War II, and they refused to bury him in a military cemetery because he was Hispanic. And so then you had a local organization in Texas form from this, and began fighting in the courts and making demands. Hey, we fought and died the same color blood as any other American, and we're entitled to the same rights, and you ought to have a sense of gratitude toward us for his name was Felix Longoria, the gentleman that they would not bury. And then you also had the Zoot Suit riots, and the Zoot Suit riots began with a fist fight between a young Mexican American who adhered to a kind of a cultural demographic at that time known as Pachucos. They had a distinctive Zoot Suit and type of culture that they followed, etc., being proud of being Mexican Americans. And this fight is going to, the Pachuco is going to get the better of a U.S. serviceman. The serviceman returns to his barracks. They see that his jaw had been broken, and they wanted revenge. And so then you have all these servicemen flooding into the streets of LA looking for any Mexican American who had the curly, long, slicked hair on the top and the short cropped hair on the sides and wearing the famous zoot suit. And they would beat them up on sight. And they were known as the zoot suit riots. And then you had a case of a murder case at that time. Jose Diaz was murdered, and they blamed a group of Pachucos on killing him. And they ended up going to prison. And years later, it was discovered who had killed Jose Diaz, and it wasn't any of those, quote, Pachucos who had been wrongfully incarcerated. So you have cases like that in World War II, whereby it's becoming glaringly apparent how unfair minority groups were treated in light of our rhetoric. And then by the end of World War II, you have the post-World War II boom. You have an economic boom. You also have the GI Bill that affords a college education. You have FHA loans that helps provide a home, especially to veterans. And that included brown and black veterans. And so the point being is that this enabled the development of a colored middle class, of a contingent of a percentage of African American, especially ex-soldiers, veterans, and Hispanic American, to realize the American dream, to get a job, to get a home, to get a college education. And with that right came arguably an increased expectation of what their rights should entail. And that just, that seems to, those two correlate historically quite often. When you get a demographic that suddenly begins to do well for itself economically, and especially becomes educated, almost in any national history, they're going to very shortly thereafter, or almost immediately, begin to demand political rights. And that's what happens here. And then also you had the challenge from the Soviet Union calling out America for its hypocrisy and how it treats its people of color. Because we were trying to win over allies during the decolonization movement at the end of World War II, with all these Asian, European, African countries fighting for their independence from predominantly European colonizers from the past, to kick them out and to have their own country. And so we were wanting in our contingency plan with NATO, just in case we go to war with the Soviet Union, we were wanting as many allies as possible. And the Soviet Union called us out and said, don't join America's NATO. Look how they treat their own people of color. So that might be another structural reason for which the government felt compelled to concede some civil rights to African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and other minority groups, women. And so, yeah. And, there have been sociological experiments where people are put to the test, not knowing it, and they are at a public venue and they are cheated in some way. Usually it's out of their money in some of the tests that I've come across. And they try to find a pattern as to who's most likely to demand rectification of wrong, and to say, basically, no, I'm not leaving. I want to talk to your manager. I'm not leaving until this gets worked out. I'm not being cheated. As opposed to those who are more deferential and more fatalist and just accepted being cheated and just walked off. And what they found, right, is rather going along age lines so much, or even color lines, what they found is that the findings seem to correlate with educational and economic lines. That those who tended to have more education and who tended to be a little better off economically tended to be more often the ones that would refuse the injustice and say, no, I want to talk to the manager. I'm not leaving until I do, and getting the injustice rectified. So that's what we have in this final one, right? So are there any questions on number 4? All right. Can I get a thumbs up? Have you guys been able to hear me the whole time and following with me? Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay, good, good. So technology's working. So the questions. So concerning the civil rights movement, World War II arguably raised American expectations regarding human and civil rights and equipped a colored middle class with a college education and post-war economic boom. That's intended to be true. All right, I'm going to skip down. I don't want to do all of them. Like I said, I believe you could find these answers in this handout. But let's take a look at number 6 on the Chicano movement, in case I didn't bring that up enough in the argumentative assignment. Which of the following does not match up regarding the Chicano movement? Crystal City, Texas arguably afforded a lesson in respecting Hispanic voting influence and collective action. Absolutely. Remember, we mentioned Jose Angel Gutierrez, the December 9th walkout of 1969 from the public schools on behalf of Chicano students and parents, and the Crystal City, Texas school board becoming homogeneously Mexican American after a particular election. B, Rodolfo Gonzalez, they called him Corky Gonzalez, greatly contributed to Mexican American consciousness, identity, and unity via his famous Soy Joaquin poem and participation in the formation of La Raza Unida Party. That is true as well. Rodolfo Gonzalez wrote a long poem called Soy Joaquin, and he really is proud of in particular, the indigenous part of his Mexican American heritage, the Aztec and the other Native Americans of Mexico, right? And contends that he's a product of the Spanish coming in and raping and pillaging the Aztec and the other Native tribes, and now being taken over since the Mexican-American War in 1848 by Los Estados Unidos, by the US. Now the Anglo, right? The Anglo has taken the Spaniards' part in becoming the new oppressor, and he defies that. So that was known as his Yo Soy Joaquin poem, I am Joaquin. And in Denver, Colorado, they established the first Mexican-American political party, a third party, and ran candidates for everything from governors and state positions to a presidential candidate known as La Raza Unida, right? Party. So Rodolfo Gonzalez was highly instrumental in all of that. And then C, Jose Angel Gutierrez's unionization of farm workers in California. No, that was Cesar Chavez. Gutierrez was a Mayo man in Texas, the Mexican American Youth Organization, which was kind of like a SNCC, like the African American SNCC. And I find it interesting also is that as far as winning over, some demographics of white Americans, look into CORE and the Freedom Rides, look into SNCC, and look and see how many liberal white people join these protests. The Freedom Summer of '64 in Mississippi, etc. It's interesting stuff. Number 7, the Johnson treatment suggests the unique influence President Lyndon B. Johnson wielded in effecting, bringing about the Civil Rights Acts of '64 and '65. And that is true. They had a name for it. He had a very strong personality as our president after JFK had been killed. And he was oftentimes on his red phone in the Oval Office, calling one House member and senator after another and trying to bring about their acquiescence, their support to civil rights legislation. So he would begin by asking them personal questions about their family members, reminding them funny memories that he might have with them to try to, cement his rapport with them. And then if that wasn't enough, he would try to appeal to their sense of shame as far as something needing to be done. And if that weren't far enough, he would tell them, he would appeal to their vanity and say that this Congress is going to be responsible for giving more legislation than the Reconstruction era Congress at the end of the Civil War. That literally appealing to their vanity, that we're going to become famous for future generations in passing this. And then if that didn't work, he would try to bribe them. He would be familiar with different, campaigns and policies and projects that they were for. And it's known as pork barrel legislation, where you throw in all kinds of extra little addendums to a law to make certain people happy and support that law. And so he would try the pork barrel approach and offer them support for building that bridge in their county or whatever it might be. But then they said that if none of those tactics worked, that he would begin to grow frustrated and he would begin to threaten and tell the people what he could do that they would not like him to do, the power that he held, the allies that he had, the degree to which they did not want him to become their enemy. I mean, it was pretty impressive pragmatically. I don't know about morally, but pragmatically, it was pretty impressive, this famous Johnson treatment and getting the Civil Rights Acts passed in the mid 1960s. All right, so are there any questions? Do you feel relatively well about the assignment and about the test questions? Any comments at all? All right, my bashful two. All right, well, if you don't have any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and end with that, okay? I hope you guys are doing well. I'll be happy to give you your extra credit points. Hang in there. We're almost finished. I believe you just have one more assignment after this. All right. And have a nice Thanksgiving.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you, Joanna.
Bye.
Thank you, Mr. Caldwell.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Alyssa. Thank you for coming as always.